We're in Del Mar, California, at the house of Katie Sanford. Katie is a long-time Jungian analyst who's still working, and also the creator of a series of 62 magnificent oil paintings that reflect and make visible a deeply experienced inner world. I'm curious, Katie, at what age did you realize your connection with your inner world and that it might be different from other people's, and how did you experience that?
I think I was plunged into the archetypal world at probably age 7, at the death of my mother. My sisters and I were taken into the Catholic hospital to tell her farewell when she knew she was dying. And my relationship with my mother had never been nurturing or positive. And on her deathbed, something in me pleaded, "Take me with you. Take me with you." And strangely enough, after that, through my childhood, into my adulthood, long before I was involved in depth psychology or any objective awareness of the inner world, I seemed to attract the people that were terminally ill and dying. And I think that inner world was probably more supportive, although totally unconscious. And until I ran into Jung, I sort of just drifted along in the outer world, doing what was expected of me to do as a woman.
And like your mother said, to be a good girl and listen to your father, right?
And on the deathbed, she said, "Now just listen to your father and do what he says." Well, I may have had no real individual connection to the world, but the animus was launched, and I'm very grateful that I pretty much survived by just the conventional shoulds of what was expected of surviving.
Right.
You get married, you have children, but I was not that connected to it.
Yeah, you said you were always different and you were the runt of the family.
And I was the runt of the family, and I'm sure that was difficult for my mother because she died before she was 40. Mm-hmm. And by that time had 7 children and buried 3.
All boys, right?
And that I have a real compassion for how stressed she must have been, and how that would have affected her having to deal with a needy child.
And this was happening in Wisconsin?
Yes, my father was a very successful wheat farmer, and he pioneered in Canada. And after they married, my mother found that isolation just intolerable. Mm-hmm. And so they moved to Wisconsin, bought a farm in Wisconsin, and that's where I was born, a little bitty town in Wisconsin. And as I talked to the people in that town, most of them had never been more than 30 miles away. And I thought, what if that the circumstances hadn't forced us to move, and I'd been stuck there? It was a shocking idea to even contemplate.
Right.
We lived with my grandmother for 3 years
Over there?
in Illinois.
Okay.
And then at the end of the 3 years, came out to join my father in California. And in those days, the four of us, I had a little sister that was 5, I was 7, another sister 9, and another sister 11. And we were given a big picnic basket full of sandwiches, put on the train, and the porter was told, now watch over them. And it took 5 days to come across the country.
Wow.
And that was a strange, strange feeling, because I had no idea where you're going. You talk about the ocean or palm trees, and it was a situation that has pretty much conditioned me to be just, you do what you have to do. And at an early age, never expected other people to care for me, but you did what you had to do.
Right.
It's kind of a tough beginning, but it can stand you well in the challenges of life.
Mm-hmm. And where you landed was not easy either. You were not very...
No, my father was not prepared. To be left with 4 girls, and after the death of my mother, in that move, of course, the financial situation, because he wasn't able to continue farming in Canada. One of the other cousins took over on that. So we ended up in La Cañada. And, and that was sort of an affluent area north of Pasadena. And we were the poor kids. We were the poor kids. And my father didn't even have a house prepared for us. He had started a chicken ranch, and we all, just as little kids, worked helping with the chicken ranch. So, to get into the, later in life, to find myself pulled into the community of Jungian analysts was a real shock, because I was quite a hick,
Mm-hmm.
And most of the people in those early days were European. They came from well-educated backgrounds, and they were sophisticated.
Right.
And it was a learning experience.
It was. So you're in La Cañada, where your father didn't have a house. Where did you sleep in one room, or how did it all go?
Well, he sort of parked us in one little section off of the building where the chickens were until he built a place, because he was a pioneer. You didn't just hire somebody to build a house.
Right.
He built it.
Right.
And that's pretty much the way I've lived. And I like it.
Uh-huh. Pioneering in La Cañada. So you guys went to school there too?
Oh, we went to school there, yes. But school was School was very difficult. And in high school, I was staggering along and finally decided, oh, I'm going to drop out because I just couldn't make it. But I've always been lucky that there would be somebody in the environment that gave me a boost. That would be like you had little angels along the way.
Right.
And there was the mother of a girlfriend of mine, and she was indignant. So she went to the high school and she said, "How come you can't teach this girl? Have you looked at her, what did they take, of the information or the intelligence test?
Yeah.
Have you looked at her intelligence test? How come you can't teach her?"
Whoa.
So with that encouragement, I went back and, just that rote learning would be totally alien, I think, to an intuitive, introverted person.
Yeah.
So it was chaotic. And when I graduated, I got a job because in those days, it was before you had any programs that were going to help you with school or living. You either got a job or you didn't eat.
Right.
And so I went to work at a sanitarium, which was probably the worst place in the world for me to be. And and there was a doctor at the sanitarium because you never made enough money to get out of there. And there was a strange little man that was a doctor there, and he came to me and he said, "Katie, get out of here. Go back to school. Go get a nursing degree. I'll give you my Gray's Anatomy." And with that, I started at junior college. And during my studies at junior college, I went on a beach party, met my husband, who was determined he was going to get married to me. And I wasn't quite so sure about it, but came Easter vacation. He was just in his internship for getting his medical degree. And he said, "We both got a week off. Let's get married and go on a trip." So I said, "Well, okay. I guess if it doesn't work, I could probably get out of it." And so we got married for this week vacation, at Easter vacation. But what do you know? I think I must have been pregnant in the first 24 hours.
Wow.
And there was no getting out of it.
Right.
And I have to say that while that marriage was not always easy, it was valuable. It was so valuable. And we were married for 65 years before he died.
That's a long time.
And he finally left his medical practice because he said there's so much psychological underlay to the specialty that he was in, which was dermatology. He said, "I'm going training in the Jung Institute." So he gave up his medical practice, which was quite a scary thing to do, to leave secure income and start out. But that was where our values lay. But of course, we were in analysis long before it.
Okay, so then we have to go back a little bit.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because I first started analysis with Max Zeller when I was 33.
And you told me at one point that you had migraines, and that...
No, it wasn't migraines. It was
it?
terrible loss of energy, loss of balance, terrible headaches. I don't think they were the typical migraine, but and you know, I was in therapy at the time, which I'd been in therapy about 5 years, and still had this just draining illness, and I could find no help from the medical direction, and there wasn't anything specific in the dreams that related to the illness until I had one dream, and the dream was, the reason of your illness is that the threshold is so low. And with that, I think it was a validation, you know, that just the carrying of the psyche was killing me. And so I decided that I was going to go to Zurich and try to find some meaning to life before I died, because I thought I was, you know, I thought I was finished.
Right.
And there, at that time, in Zurich, you would see preferably two different therapists a week, and you'd go to the lectures almost every day. So you were just immersed in the reality of the unconscious, or in dealing with the unconscious. And it sort of shifted the kind of the collective endorsement of following the inner path. And I think from that time on, healing began.
So you had less psychosomatic.
Tremendous.
So and that threshold, that lower threshold at that point, became more doable, and I really believe that for those that are open to the reality of the unconscious, the reality of the archetypal collective unconscious, that the critical issue, since the psyche is amoral, the critical issue is how the individual will find the channel or the expression to live that and give it a more conscious direction, which is what my life has been dedicated to since that time. And you, was that in 55?
That was in 1955.
And did you meet Jung that time?
And there, because my dream material was so archetypal, and Jung at that time was so interested in flying saucers, and so the images in my dreams were kind of related to that energy. And so at that time, in 55, he was seeing very few people. He worked, I think he tried to give time to theologians and to medical doctors. But regular patients, he had pretty much closed down that avenue. And so, it was, I'm going to get to see Jung. And so I get on the train from Zurich to Küsnacht and, get off the train, walk down that big avenue to his home, and I think, thank goodness the mystery of life now will be resolved. And went in, he just had a flannel shirt on, and he's sitting in his library, and he's like, well, how are you? Hello? And I didn't know what to say. And he said, you see that Buddha sitting on the table there? Yes. Well, pick it up. And I think, I'm not going to mess with your stuff. So I just kind of eyed the Buddha, and he got so impatient, and he said, pick it up. So I reached over and I tried to pick that up. It was so heavy. I just could hardly budge it off the table. And he said, now you see, if you have that little connection to outer reality, it's very important. It won't be polite, but it's important that you put your hands on things and find out what they are. Well, the hour was almost over, so we get up, and he puts his arm around my shoulder and walks me to the door. So long, good luck. And I walked out and I thought, what happened? And it was, at first it felt like quite a letdown, I thought maybe he'd just sort of pat me on the head and say, oh, you'd really struggle hard, you do a good job. But no, sir. He was the most genuine human encounter I think I've ever had in my life. And afterwards I thought, he's given me the very thing I need the most. And then I didn't see him after that because Emma Jung died 2 days later. And all of Zurich was just in mourning. And so, but it was a very meaningful awareness of just how far off I was in the inner reality and the need to, clutch on to the outer reality too.
And it was only a few years after that you started to paint, right? And that you took the real oil paints and the canvases.
Yes, in therapy, I didn't do canvases, but I would do little images of these wicked little animus figures and other little symbolic kind of representations of whatever the dream material had been. The first painting, I think, is 1959.
Yeah, that's what I have here too. Yeah.
Was 1959.
The large ones. Yeah, it's this one, right?
Which is pretty much
You want to?
it shows would be this painting. And it showed the split between the Christian and the instinctual. And I think this was just sort of the lump of clay that my painting started with. But, and how all of this kind of emerges out of the Great Mother as a kind of intuitive potential of enlightenment or wholeness.
Right. Is the guy, the figure on the left, is he holding a gun or something?
Here?
Yeah.
No. He's praising the light.
Oh, he's praising the light. Okay.
No. The gun came earlier. and of course the serpent. And the serpent as that sort of Euroboric, instinctual wholeness.
So here you are. That was your first painting, and then you really took to it, didn't you?
Oh, it provided such a valuable perspective. Mm-hmm. It was as if the impasse that I had worked up to in my therapy needed a container, and I really was more a challenge than starting out with a preconceived idea of what it would be. Mm-hmm. And so there was a lot of oil paint that went on, it got scrubbed off, and what wanted to be on that canvas. And if I stayed open to that and just had to feel around, then when it felt right, mm-hmm. I could go on and flesh out the canvas. But all of it would be what wants to be up in the corner, or what wants to be in the center. So I really feel I'm more a channel, and I'm not a trained artist. I'm a dilettante, and.
But I think what you have in common with anybody who has a creative impulse is indeed to be open to what comes up from the psyche.
Uh-huh. So, I had played around with throwing pots and wood carving and this and that, but it was really to get that image on the canvas and then to have a little objectivity mm-hmm, mm-hmm. to whatever the dynamic was trying to emerge.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why we are so lucky that we can actually see the visualization of a process that you're going through. That's really very valuable.
I also think it's why the images have any relevance to anybody else, because it's really not mine.
You're the channel. It's channeled through you.
It's sort of channeled through me. And as I've aged, I more and more get the feeling that the individual is here to help evolution of consciousness. Mm-hmm. And you have to have that openness to where you're not that important, but you're the vehicle.
Yes. Yes. So here you were, as I have imagined you after you mentioned that one time, standing in the kitchen behind your canvas, and because this is not an easy struggle that you went through. I mean, this is when you
It's
look
a
at
life
the
struggle.
paintings, yeah,
It's a life struggle. But I was very fortunate that, of course, my husband was a very rational man, but at least he honored and he supported what I had to do. And once, it's hard to submit to a process like that.
Yeah.
I think a really creative process, and I would do anything I could to avoid it. I'd clean the house, or maybe shine silver, but kind of walk around that canvas. But then the day that I finally, and I'd eat, just anything to put it off. But once I got started, everything else stopped.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an amazing process.
And I think the intensity of that was that I think in the first, how many months? The first seven paintings were done just one right after another.
Yeah, they're all in the same year.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And so it just began to pour out.
Right. And then you went to Zurich again in 57, right?
I went in 57, and I went then because my husband had taken a 6 months leave from his medical practice and went to Zurich for 6 months.
Right.
And I went to join him there and worked for a while there. Then I went back in, I don't remember these dates, but it would be 60 or 61. And
it must have been 60, because this is that really important moment that you discovered the Hopi.
But it was, I think, around that same time that I had gone to Zurich.
Mm-hmm.
And because Liliane Fry, with whom I worked, had asked if I would present these early paintings at the Institute there, give a lecture at the Institute. And which I did. And the very interesting thing, there were a couple of theologians there, and they came to me afterwards and they said, what a pity that material like this isn't taught in the seminaries. And but it was also in 1960 that I heard about the snake dance, that James Kirsch told us about the snake dance. Mm-hmm. And we inquired at the University of Northern Arizona, and they said, yes, these are the things you need to be aware of, and how you dress, just the courtesies.
Right.
And so we decided to go. Mm-hmm. And this was going to, as I say, the snake dance. And we got over to Aribe, which is the oldest continually inhabited village in the North American continent. And there were no other whites around. then we went down to Old Arriby's up on the mesa, and then down at the foot of Old Arriby is what they were calling then New Arriby. It's now called Smovie. But this was New Arriby. And there was a little old trading post there. And walked in, and I've never in my life felt like I was invisible, the minority. We were the only whites. And I felt my gut was in a turmoil. I felt such an intruder. And the Indians in there just were impassive. You didn't exist. Except Henry, who was running the trading post. And he finally came over and he said, well, where are you people from? My daughter, my husband and I. And we said, oh, we're from San Diego. And he said, San Diego. I was in the service in Camp Callan. Camp Callan was then where the University of San Diego is now, UCSD. San Diego. Oh, is the zoo still there? You know, is Point Loma still there? And we said, oh, yes, you know. He said, oh, why don't you go up and see my wife? And I thought, I've done the most I can do to get here and stand this. And I didn't do it at that time. But he wrote his name and his box number on the little piece of paper. And I came home and I thought, darn, what an opportunity I missed. Because the minute that he had that relationship to us, the other Indians sort of moved in, you know. Mm-hmm. And he said, you know, there's going to be another dance beside the snake dance. There'll be the butterfly dance, which is in Old Arriby. So why don't you go? And by the time we got to the dance, we knew that all the village had heard about Henry's connection, because I said, you know, if you ever get to San Diego, because he said, oh, I'd love my family, you know, to see the ocean. And, I said, we have lots of room, you can stay with us. And, so then suddenly, you know, the message had disseminated. And that was the beginning of a real connection, because when I got home and I thought, oh, darn, to miss meeting his wife. So I gathered information on the zoo, I gathered information about San Diego, you know, all of this, and said it to them. So they stayed here for 3 weeks, and they stayed out in the little house where Allison lives now. And you know, they had no running water in Arriby. They have no telephones. No electricity. They luxuriated. They bathed and they washed their hair, and they, you know, and then, while Sandy had to go to the office, but I was here, we'd have breakfast, and we'd sit at that breakfast table, and the storytelling would start. And the most wonderful material came out of those 3 weeks. And I would never have taped that, because they trusted me. And I was not going to violate that trust. And I think they've felt that. But with that rich, rich experience. And, you know, after that, we were just part of the family. And that lasted for about, well, it lasted up until their death, and it's still viable, but it's so different today.
Yeah.
And
Because that you talked about the archetypal of, for example, the Kachina dance, where they would come over the hill. And
that's
how,
right. But the interesting thing about going to that snake dance, that it wasn't, well, I don't think I've really thought about it until something like this came up, that as I looked in those first seven paintings that I did, there were the images of, well, I start out with the difficulty with the snake.
Right.
This was the fourth painting that I had done, and it shows the snake climbing up the cross into the hands of this archetypal feminine, but the snake is carrying this kind of nimbus of light, so that there was this intuitive thing of what consciousness would be carried by that instinctual life. Then the next painting, which is a little big probably to see, would be where this would be more the ego, not the former feminine figure would be more archetypal, but here would be the feminine, the ego, holding the serpent up to nurse at the breast. And this I saw as the hand of God coming out of those stormy clouds, almost like a benediction. And so to go over to a society that had the snake as a religious, numinous force of life on which their survival depended, because in that dance they had first the antelope tribe come out, line up, and they're kind of the witnesses of this, and they have their participation. And then the snake priest comes out, and he has an apron full of these snakes, and they're big snakes, rattlesnakes, garter snakes, bull snakes, all of these. And they have been for 2 weeks in the kiva with the whatever ceremonies they do to interact with these serpents. And then comes the day for the dance, where the public will participate. So it comes out, and in his apron are all these snakes. And they're placed in a little kind of bower that's called a kishi. And that is placed over the center of the world, in the middle of the plaza. And then the snake dancers come out. And one by one, the dancer goes up, reaches into this kishi, pulls out a snake, and they will be dance in couples. So one man has his arm around the shoulders of the other man. He has a little stick with a little prayer feather on the end. This dancer reaches in, gets the snake, carries it in his teeth, and this one distracts the snake with his little feather. And those snakes will be danced to the four corners, the four directions of the world, and then they will be placed in a circle in the middle of the dancers. And there's a man there with a little whisk, and he just sort of keeps them corralled in this circle. And that goes on till every one of those snakes are danced. And there's a pile of snakes like this. And they have been blessed as they've danced by the women putting sacred cornmeal, blessing them as they dance. At the end, when they have all the snakes are danced, the snake dancers come in and they just grab a handful of these snakes and they run out to the edge of the mesa and turn them loose so that they'll carry the message from the human beings back to nature.
Wow.
And that really hit home for me.
Yeah.
Then I saw a really interesting thing, which is a little divorced. But after those dancers, these are not Kachinas, these are men of the two clans. After that dance is completed and the dancers disperse, if you're really lucky, you will see the dancers that have had to carry the role of kind of this superhuman vehicles in this process run out to the edge of the mesa and take a pneumatic and vomit up the spirit. So they don't stay identified with the role of the Savior.
Right.
And then they come back and it's just Joe and Sam.
Right.
And I think, too bad analysts don't realize that. So that we get back to our humanity
Yeah.
rather than the savior of our clients.
Right. Yeah, that's a very important issue.
Mm-hmm.
So you painted. You said these are two paintings that are very
Those were
representative for that particular period in time that you saw these dances.
This would be much later.
Oh, this is much later.
This would be,
Okay.
I think this would be a bit later. But this certainly was where the snake had that kind of metamorphosis into the spirit. It was, sort of humanized. But those years of experience with the Hopi were so reinforcing to the connection to the religious validity of just the spirit of nature. This painting, too, would be relevant to that Hopi experience. And while this figure is the transformation of this serpent, and this painting came out of a terrifying dream where I dreamed that I had gone to the back door and I'd picked up this bottle of water, and inside I could feel something moving. And I saw that it was the serpent. The serpent was in there. And the sensation of holding that with this movement inside that was so terrifying that I knew I had to give some kind of an image to it. And what evolved is that the serpent, in this more transformed spiritual form, emerges out of this dream bottle of water. And where it emerges is into the Hopi village, because here are their little stone houses, and on top of the roofs are the eagles, and this would be for the home dance. And at the home dance is when the Kachinas, who have been in with the people for 6 months, coming in February, which is like a solstice, really, and it's called the bean dance. And that's when the Kachinas arrive. They've been on the San Francisco peaks for 6 months, sort of like Demeter and Persephone. So the Kachinas have been up in the mountains for 6 months, and now is the time they're returning to the Hopi. And preparation for this has gone on as they have planted beans down in the kiva. And Henry had told me, among our conversations, that one man would be in charge of tending these beans, and that the whole future for the Hopi depended on that being successful, and that in the early days, if anything happened to that, the man would be sacrificed. But of course, that was no longer true. But so that would have been the beginning of the cycle. This is the home dance. It's now in July, and the Hopi, the Kachinas, are getting ready to return. And at that time, I'm a little mixed up here. Earlier, in preparation for the home dance, they would go out to gather eaglets from the nests. And these eaglets would be tethered to the roofs of the houses. And they would be given the choicest food until they were mature at the time of the home dance. So here the eagles are. And after the Kachinas have returned, these eagles are sacrificed. They're ceremonially smothered, and their feathers will be used for the pahos that you'll see hanging around the house here. So here, the woman is held by this nature spirit in that setting. And it was the greatest endorsement to be accepted and really received by a community in which the serpent was such a powerful numinous force. And that, I think that provided a great deal of comfort, but also reinforcement in the process, because in those early days, 1959, 60, this kind of archetypal imagery was pretty alien to the collective. And I found, even in the training program, when we were to have some discussion or make some presentation about archetypes, I had taken up 2 or 3 of those paintings. And even in the training group, there was this kind of pull back, and I thought it was a mistake to bring them. And I played it pretty close to the chest. Aside from the family and my therapist, I didn't like that part of myself to be exposed. So to have this, to be in an environment where that kind of energy was kind of one of the ruling powers, was that played a very important part in my life. And in a way, May, there was just something about her big, warm body, and she really cared for me, and I really cared for her. And I think I found the great mother in her, in an outer way. And her death by a car accident was a real loss. A real loss. But, you know, it's through those losses that one has to do the inner work to find what has been carried by the outer projection.
And what's so interesting is that there is such a connection and homecoming that you felt. That really became even more possible to get on with that process that you're working on there.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So it's
that one is also extremely interesting. The ball and this one you.
And this would be much later, and I feel for the woman that the integration of her masculine animus side is just the hub of the individuation process.
For a woman.
For a woman.
Yeah.
I only know intellectually about a man's psychology, but I wouldn't be at all surprised that the hub of his individuation might have an awful lot to do with the anima, too, the integration of the anima. But these eyes, which have appeared in earlier paintings, but they are those, it's almost like the eyes of God. Mm-hmm. And to see how the sacrifice and on the cross, which would imply a transformation, and a cross of the Trinity, that patriarchal Trinity, is taking place within a Hopi bowl.
Yeah, contained.
And within the spirit of the Hopi. And that with that sacrifice and transformation, how much growth there is possible.
Yeah.
But this would be one of the later paintings.
Right. So, Katie, you talk a lot about the struggle that you had with the animus. If you would have to put that in more lay terms, how would you explain that?
Well, with no position of my own, I think the defense, and that this would be not just for myself, but you have only the conventional. You have no individual discrimination, but you only have the rules of the convention to help you deal with the world. And for the woman, if we think of her nature, her natural role, that would be more with the earth, with the home, with the body, and so how essential that masculine archetype, but also it's a strange function because partly personal, partly archetypal, but how essential that is for her bridge for any expression in the outer world. Because if we look at the feminine, just by the feminine, we're thinking of the unconscious, we're thinking of nature, and how does that get translated out into the world? And without any sense of my individual validity, I only had the shoulds, how children should be raised. And years later, when I was working with Hilda Kirsch, I came up with some conventional declaration, and it was no sooner out of my mouth than I thought, and I said, "Oh, Hilda, that damn animus." And she said, "Katie, you had better be careful, because that got you through when you had nothing else." So life isn't always easy.
So that was a big struggle to integrate that in a way so that you could use it and
it's taken most of my life to integrate that.
The funny thing is, when you're talking about that, I'm looking at the painting behind you, so I'll give you the image too. This painting. There is something about that painting.
Yes,
Because
and that was
so
a
beautiful.
critical time between the possibility of something new to balance out this dismemberment, that was coming up from the unconscious. Now, this was one that I would have taken for that presentation in Zurich. And one of the participants said, "Isn't that interesting that you have the Great Mother in the form of the vulture?"
Oh, yeah.
I had never thought of it. I'd never thought of that, as to how that destructive side of the Great Mother could be over this explosion and just this dismemberment
Right.
of, but that there's just the new day breaking over here. And I think it was an important part of the process, because she's looking down to see what's coming up from below.
Snakes.
See, she's looking down. If you look at that window,
Yeah.
and she's just standing on that precipice. And it was And it was subsequently where I think this kind of symbolic imagery is so helpful to see that that whole side of the tree of life that's just been denuded by that explosive darkness begins to leaf out.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it's individuation is quite a struggle.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's there's in all your paintings there's a really almost physical pain. It's really you can really feel how difficult it is.
I struggled with that complexity, thinking that it was so just personal. Although James Kirsch, when I'd be working, because I'd work periodically, first with James and then with Hilda at different times.
After Max Seller.
After Max Seller. Max, bless his heart, had said, I think we've gone together as far as I can go. I'm going to send you to James. But before Hilda died, she said, you know, you have a very unusual connection to the unconscious, and James knows it. And I thought, what is she talking about? Because I never realized how often the reality of the unconscious is intellectualized. And it's not, and coming from a kind of inside out, it's like my early experience was in the archetypal world, and I had to find my way into the outer collective world, while the approach to the psyche, my approach to the psyche would have been that way. While for most of the people, they're starting from an intellectual concept to go down. And for a long time, I felt that I was in an inferior position. And it took most of my life to realize what an advantage. At least if you're down there, there's more push to try to get up than there is to lose that rational certainty and open yourself to the hazards of the unconscious. If you're coming out of the hazards, you know,
well, you use
help looks good.
Right. You use the phrase stepping stones. Or ladder. You also use the word ladder in connection to that.
And in a way, these were the archetypal stepping stones that got me out of that kind of abyss of the pleroma into the world.
Right. You said they were life-saving, the paintings, and you said it was through that active imagination, the symbolic support, that connection with that symbolic life that just put me on the path to health. That is what you said. And
yes.
So Katie, if somebody who was not so versed with Jungian terminology would hear about active imagination and they would ask, what is that exactly? How would you explain that?
Well, by active imagination, I mean a kind of direct dialogue between whatever the issue is with the ego. And, and, if one, and Marie-Louise von Franz has said that active imagination, where the ego, the waking ego, is involved with the unconscious complex that's activated, is much stronger than dream work, because the ego is already involved. And if you just wait for a dream without that awakened ego participation, one will just reprocess the dream by what they already know. Mm-hmm. But the unconscious, or the dream, or the complex, only comes at you from unbidden, because you don't know it. So that active participation, while you're conscious, mm-hmm. is apt to be much more beneficial than if you get something totally unknown from the unconscious that just comes in like you're reading a book or something like that. You're not already involved.
Right.
And
I think Jung also always said that it was such a good tool to take with you when you would not be in analysis anymore.
Oh, indeed. I think anyone that thinks they've arrived at consciousness and they can now relax and just work with particularly for an analyst, that their involvement with the unconscious will be through their clients,
right.
has kind of given up the ghost. Mm-hmm. And so this awareness of, the little devils that hang around and haunt you, that's pretty fertile work for the animus, for right. the ego, mm-hmm. to go to work on that. Right. And it's very interesting. I think if one really can persist in getting the animus participation, which is the support for going in that introverted discrimination. Is this mine? Does it mean this? Does it mean that? Do I like it? Don't I like it? That if one keeps that responsibility for their activities or their responses throughout their life, hopefully that animus, instead of acting as a complex and just having to be challenged as an opposite, becomes a function.
Right.
So that more and more they work together.
So this painting, I love this. Is one of my favorite paintings.
And this was a good example, because here the animus stands in support of the feminine, and you think of feminine individuation, it will be rooted in the feminine. Mm-hmm. But how to get your message into the world, or your reality rounded out into how you express yourself in the world, he's the helper in discrimination. Right. But he should be working for her. While in contrast, in the conventional patriarchal world, she works for him. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. With the shoulds and what's right, what's wrong. But here, he supports that she holds her staff of authority as a feminine individual, and he holds the support for the feminine principle as well. And as I may have mentioned before, part of this picture came from a dream, where in the dream there was this not sweater, but
Mantle? Mantle?
this cloak,
Cloak.
that was woven of natural fibers, beautiful cloak. And I'm very interested as I'm watching this being woven. And they say, well, this is woven for you. And it's a protection to keep you warm, keep your back warm, keep your unconscious, cozy. And so that was the support on which this cooperation of masculine and feminine was painted. Soon after I'd painted this, I went to Bali with Donald Sanford from San Francisco. And he was very interested in the natural healers. And we had gone to Bali to study the Balian, who were the Balinese healers. But there was a psychiatrist there, and he and I kind of took off to see what it was the group was leaving out. And one of the things we found that there were other Balians, and one was this higher class fellow, and we went to see him, and he operated quite differently. We were the only people there, for one. And he had his little platform, and it was that I was to sit down cross-legged in front of him, and he goes over my back, over my shoulders. Thanks, and he says, "Oh, I see the cloak of Mary. You're wearing the cloak of Mary to protect you." And I thought, wow, this is pretty interesting. Well, at that time, he was trying to get another person to join them and share the expenses of going to the outback of Australia, where we had a guide that was going to take us camping through the outback to Ayers Rock. And I thought, well, if Mary's protecting me, I'm going to go. So I did. But unfortunately, I didn't let my husband know I was going to miss my flight home, because I got pretty preoccupied in other things. So when I got home, I didn't have a happy husband. But I would have to say that experience of that trust to take off something so unusual from my dutiful role that I'd carried up to that time changed my life forever. And it was worth the price I paid. So this painting I keep in my bedroom, and every time anything comes up, I kind of look at it and I think, well, how do you think it goes? This is pretty interesting, and it helps me process. So I have two paintings. The one above my mantle, and this one I keep in my bedroom. And those I will keep for my lifetime, and on my death, they can go with the rest of the paintings to the archives at Pacifica. So that's the story of this painting. And there was a very interesting experience that let me know how similar the process is for the Hopis grasping an image, well, I would call it an archetypal image. They'd call it a kachina, a value. Jessie and Phil. Jessie was May and Henry's daughter, and Phil was, May couldn't have any more children, so someone had given her one of their children, and that was Phil. Mm-hmm. So Jessie must have been about 12, and Phil was about 10 or 11. And we were over there, and Phil said, well, you know, if you go down around the cliffs of Oribe, they have all these petroglyphs. And, well, they're very interesting. You want to go? And I said to May, is it all right if we go? Is it all right? And May says, well, yes, yes. And Jessie said, well, I've never been there. So off we go. And there's a trail that leads down along the ledge of the mesa. And, they bury the people in the cliffs of the mesa with bowls and stuff like that. And we started down there, and, there were bones on the path and broken pottery and stuff. And true, there were petroglyphs, and we walk around till we got out to the very end of the mesa. And then there's an incline where we got up on top again, out by that old burned out church that's out there. There are no houses out there. Walking along, and I saw these like little creches, just little, about like this, about that wide, maybe about that tall. And in front of them and around them were all these prayer feathers, all these pahos. And I said to Phil, what is this? And Phil said, well, when somebody gets an image of a new spirit, they come out and they meditate here to see what that kachina wants to be. And I thought, my gosh, how different is that?
Yeah.
When I first fell in love with the Hopi, I thought, they've got the answer. And it wasn't until I said to May, if I ever got really in trouble, I think I'd come here to the Hopi, to have them save me. And she just looked at me as if, what the hell are you talking about? And I thought, no, that wouldn't work. I have to translate. I have to translate what they have as kachina spirits into what I experience as archetypes. And if I had said that to them, they wouldn't know what I was talking about. Mm-hmm. But after that, it was always that kind of translation. But there was such an authentic thread between within the collective unconscious that it was a great enrichment for for my consciousness.
And validation, probably, of...
Oh, and validation, you know, that it's, the spirit's universal.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But that was an unusual trek. And Jesse said, you know, I've never been down here. And I haven't been here because the Hopis say that if you come down here, the spirit of the dead will pull you under. And, but she said, you know, the white people go to the cemeteries and that doesn't happen. So, you know, already that kind of rational was coming in. But I think for us too, if we're not awfully careful,
yeah,
this unconscious will try to suck us back under.
You started training in 1971, right?
Right.
And then you were 54 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So how was that? How did you, what's the adventure?
Well, it was very interesting. I knew I had a kind of natural gift to work with the unconscious. But I had no academic training. I had no qualifications for going in as a therapist. So Max Zeller, before he came to the United States, was a graphologist. So I studied graphology. And that didn't really excite me, but I found it very valuable in the material that would come with new clients to be able to get the kind of overall profile through whatever handwriting they had. So that was valuable, but I didn't pursue that. And I was really at a loss of what direction to find in life. And then in the 60s, in Los Angeles, you know, with how open everything was in the 60s, Gilda and I, because of life experience, because, you know, we both, since our early 30s, been involved with our own inner process and worked with Jung along that line.
And married to analysts.
And, well, I wasn't married to an analyst at the time. Oh,
Sandy was not?
See, Sandy was a medical doctor at that time. And so in the 60s, it was proposed that we be admitted into the training program on life experience with the idea or the rationality that we could work under our husband's medical umbrella.
Okay.
And Gilda and I plugged very valiantly along, although we had, neither one of us, any experience with clinical work per se, but we'd been involved in our artistic work. And all went along just, you know, once they got us in there. I don't think they had any idea what to do with us. And Gilda finally said, you know, they've given us the ring, but they don't want to set a marriage date. Somewhere along, she heard that Antioch Without Walls had a campus over in Hollywood, and went and explored. And after they interviewed her, they said, well, if you can get a master's, we'll give you a bachelor's equivalency. So she came back and told Hilda Kirsch. And Hilda and Gilda said, Katie, you've got to do it. Well, now I am 10 years Gilda's senior. Mm-hmm. And I said, I can't do it. I'm almost 60 years old. I can't do it. But there was no resisting it. And Hilda and Gilda, they pushed me. You go for an interview. Well, this little campus was right across from Pantages Theater, mm-hmm. up in the attic of an old wooden building. So you went up one of these little narrow staircases, you know, with graffiti on the wall and all. And I went up and had an interview. And fortunately, the fellow that was the head of the psychiatric, or the psychology, that program that prepared you for a marriage family mm-hmm, license. Mm-hmm. What was his name? He had studied in Zurich and had stayed in Zurich until his wife had had a breakdown, which brought him back to the States. And he then took the job. And he was the one that was running the program Gilda and I were. And that's, I think, where I would say that it just seemed like little angels along the way, you know, just. So Gilda and I were the only ones in there working for this master's program. And the first year, that meant that you had to validate the equivalency
right.
of a bachelor's program, which went back to any lectures that I'd given and the material I'd given in Zurich. And we really worked. And at the end of, I think, 2 years, both Gilda and I got our master's degree. Wow. Yeah. At this time, Hilda Kirsch, who had been my advocate, because I was different from a lot of the other trainees at the time, both in age and also I played it pretty close to the chest. I just knew that what I was into was not that understandable at that time. But Hilda Kirsch, she's one that will be able to work with the archetypal material of any client she sees. At that time, Hilda was terminally ill, and I was desperate to get finished with what she had supported. Mm-hmm. So within 3 weeks, I managed to get my bachelor's degree, my marriage family license, and my certification as a Jungian analyst.
Wow, that's pretty amazing.
Before she died.
Wow.
And in some ways, I think Gilda and I were better prepared for depth psychology because of our age, our having been educated through the experiential necessity rather than the intellectual interest or fascination. Yeah. And it wasn't until years later that Mel Kettner, who was San Francisco, and married Betty Metter, and they now live in Ramona. So he's now with the San Diego Society. And something came up about this, and he said, I can't tell you how horrified we were in San Francisco when we heard that Los Angeles had taken 2 people into training with no background to qualify them. But, you know, I think both Gilda and I have contributed our share.
Oh, absolutely. You really have.
And
Yeah.
and she continues.
Yeah, she continues. Now you said that this particular image belongs with that period, and I wonder.
Yes, and here's where I would say, not necessarily as it went with my process, but I think this is a validity, that here the individual offers the apple to the serpent. The apple, if you will, if you think of the apple being the consciousness of good and evil. And now I think it's the individual that helps educate the psyche, to integrate the psyche and give it a form that takes an individual consciousness of discrimination of how that archetype will be expressed. So that, I think that with the help of the animus, as you see, because he helps bring it up from below.
He also looks there in that painting very shadow-like.
Well, he's dark and he's in the water, you know, so. But he's the one that brings it up from below.
Right.
But it's how important it is for the individual to provide the expression of the archetype in a more conscious way. So I don't know how relevant that is, but seems important. And she stands by the tree of life.
Right.
So that was a very interesting shift of responsibility.
Yeah. It's also, I was thinking back to that presentation you gave in Zurich with your first set of paintings, and where you said that Esther Harding had said that the greatest gift that Jung had given was the validity of the symbolic life. And that, of course...
I think that was Eleanor Bertine.
Oh, really?
Eleanor Bertine.
Okay.
Symbolic thinking. Because different than a sign, the symbol carries a kind of unexplainable mystery.
Mm-hmm. So you have tried to do that?
I have had to do that.
You have had to do that. Well, you tried and did.
I have tried and did.
Yeah. And
it wasn't until I dared to expose that to the North-South Conference that outer reinforcement pushed me to do more with them than I had done. Because before that, they were all stuffed out in the garage.
I know, I saw them there. I was amazed. I came to visit, and there were all those paintings.
You just had to jam them in. There were so many.
I know. I remember.
And when I dared to do that, and I just thought, you've been going to these meetings for 25 years, and you're such a coward that you don't open your mouth And it was either stand up and
Be counted.
be counted or shut up forever. And there it was with fear and trembling that I exposed what I'd been doing. But San Francisco just was so excited. And they said, this has to be published. You have to do this. And they wouldn't let up. And I didn't want to do it. I didn't know how to do it. My daughter was a great help because she did a lot of the legwork of how do you publish a book? And I could not find a publisher that would take the chance on 62 colored images.
Yeah.
And so finally we just did it.
Right.
Just floundered around and did it. It's not a perfect book by any means. Lynette did an awful lot of cleaning up the written part, and Dean was helping with the visuals, but he died before the visuals were put on in the text. And unfortunately, the fellow that took over, the first time I saw the galley of that, the pictures had all been cropped, they'd been cut in half, it just slapped onto the page, and the paintings in the book still are cropped.
Really?
And I didn't realize that till Theo Abt was using that book for one of his classes in Zurich. And one of the classes he was using was on paintings and how what's left out of a painting, and he picked up.
Wow. Yeah, and that's a no, you can't do that.
So, fortunately.
But still, what happened to your book and the whole flood of interests and the fact
The
that
response to it was just...
Yeah, and now all your paintings are in the archive of Pacifica, and
It
that
opened
must-
up
that must feel
a
so
whole
good, yeah.
new chapter.
Yeah,
It dragged me into the world
yeah.
in a way I would never have imagined.
That you really from that introverted child to this accomplished woman who,
Of the shadow.
yeah. And you already earlier said something about how important it is to reinforce the reality of symbolic life, and that we're put here to help evolution. You said that earlier.
Yes.
And I think that's really
that's
important.
our task.
Yeah. And not just to find happiness. And that was
Well,
a funny
happiness
story
is-
that you told me about
happiness-
James Kirsch.
Happiness is a funny expectation. And fortunately, my husband and I were very different. And once the dire necessities of life were taken care of, things got pretty rough. And he was working with James Kirsch at the time. And he came home and told me that he had said to James, "All I want is just to be happy." And James said to him, "Why do you think you should be happy? Have you looked at the reality of the world? Happiness really is for children." And in some ways, it is a kind of a naive expectation. And I certainly don't want or expect or propose that people just suffer. But I do think there is something for me that's much more valuable than happy, and that would be meaning. Meaning and a certain peace that can be made with meaning. Unfortunately, that serves a greater part of my life today than it ever did earlier.
So now there's two more questions right now that I know you're going to be 98 next month, and you told me that you still dream quite a bit.
Prolifically. Which so many older people say they don't dream anymore. And I would say that tension just builds up and builds up. And it will be when the dream work begins to flow that there's a certain release.
Yeah.
So, in a way, I'm so geared to the inner reality that I think it sometimes takes quite precedence over the outer activity.
So you still write them down?
Oh, indeed. And I still, well, I never paint on the canvas anymore, but I still, with many of the really important dreams, will, just with the colored pencils, try to sketch that dream.
Right. And that has a similar function. It contains
and it gives it a container, and it gives it objectivity.
Right. Right.
And those, because I can see the value that those paintings might have for the archive, those I will leave for the archive. And I write the dream. Whatever prompted that, I write on the back of it.
Right.
As I did on the original canvases, I just wrote in pencil the whatever associated thoughts or meanings went with it.
You wrote those on the back, or you wrote them on a piece of paper? Or?
I wrote them on the back.
You wrote them on the back.
So I had a very dedicated daughter and granddaughter that took the trouble to decipher those and put them in my little workbooks so that I could use them. So but Eras, San Francisco Eras, too, has all that. It has the whole book.
So what about being 98? It's very soon. Any thoughts that you want to share?
It's a very rich time. It's a rich time, and in some ways, the world has changed so much, and it's a tremendous reinforcement for the evolution of consciousness. But it's a very rich time.
But you're saying it doesn't stop, ever.
And it doesn't stop.
Yeah.
And the dreams, I think, are a kind of wonderful reinforcement for giving up the control of all aspects of life that in earlier times are so powerful. So, and I think for a long time while I had the lectures all lined up, and I used to laugh and say, gosh, I'm like George Burns. I can't die yet because I have commitments. Then when the commitments were over, it suddenly felt very vacant, you know. And I think, why am I still here? Mm-hmm. And I have to say, well, God isn't through with me yet. And you never know.
No, you don't.